Welcome to After School Democracy, the podcast that attempts to fill in the gaps you almost certainly missed in school about politics, economics, and history. So I've been dealing with a lot of leftists on the internet, especially in meme farm rooms. And I've discovered that European leftists seem to really not understand how a federal system works, specifically on the American level, with all the checks and balances. Partially because some of it's stupid, because they have a parliamentary system. But to be fair, neither do American leftists, or American liberals, or Americans in general for that matter. We focus on the people, not the party, and that is a huge problem. In a parliamentary system, you mostly vote for the party, aka you have an MP, like you have in the House of Representatives here in the US, and they vote for the Prime Minister, whom they pick. If we had a parliamentary system in the US right now, Pelosi would have a much more power, and the Senate, if it even existed, and the President would have way less power. They have a 2-week election that can happen out of the blue sometimes, though it's usually scheduled. The default state of parliamentary government is the party in power has the power. They can do what they want to, within certain restrictions. And if they don't have enough of a majority, they either make a coalition or have a bunch more elections until there's enough cooperation to get something done. Anything the party does is judged on its merits, and what the Prime Minister says is essentially what the party believes in and does. If a member of that party votes against the Prime Minister enough times, they can literally be kicked out, or have pretty much no power in the party at all. In the US, on the other hand, the President is independent of the House, who is also independent of the Senate, filled with people who are all independent and barely come together into a coalition to make one government. The party is also made up of a bunch of independent actors, though the party leadership, also picked by the members of the party and voters of the party belonging to that party, can have a feedback loop on who is elected. The states are also independent of the federal government, with their own fragmented mirror dependencies of the federal government, and so are cities. Pulling people into a coalition and making real change happen is super hard, and gaining, say, leadership in the House and the Senate requires just a majority of votes of a party, even if you strongly disagree with someone in your party on really basic things from a solid red or solid blue state, because there is no way a person like you could ever win in that state without tweaking the message to independently represent what the voters want. But this massive, messy behemoth somehow plods along, or at least up until now. So the right just has to gum up the works at any one level and nothing gets done. And the president, who remember is independent of Congress, gets all the blame for the Senate or the House sitting on their hands as everything goes to hell. Yeah, it's stupid. It's not straightforward, and it requires a landslide to make even the littlest change at all now. The default for the American government is inaction and paralysis, and the GOP, who claim they want small government, get votes for doing just this, making the government do nothing. And when they get into power, they increase their authoritarianism until they do so terribly, like with Katrina and 2 failed wars, and hopefully COVID this time, that they swing back to the Dems because they're just the alternative. But how did we get like this? Where did this seriously messed up system of government come from? Well, basically, it was trial and error and, of course, slavery. The United States was the very first republic since Rome. They feared tyranny of at least the landholding elites, and the world was much simpler and people were much more independent, with Jefferson's ideal of the yeoman farmer pre-Second Industrial Revolution, so they made it really, really hard to change anything and do anything. Consensus was the rule, otherwise things stayed the same way they were. They also didn't allow immortal corporations and only allowed them in very rare instances, so it worked relatively well. France was the next republic and tried our system with some tweaks, which gives them some advantages over us. The president was supposed to be the only representative of the entire population, while each member was a direct representative of either their state or their district, though proportional voting in certain states may be a much better option to reduce the problems of gerrymandering, so everyone is actually more represented. The House represented the direct population of the nation and was divided accordingly by state. However, the little states worried they'd be bossed around by the bigger states, especially the southern ones, who had a lot of people. Remember, states considered themselves their own countries at this point, why they're called states. but they were majority slaves, and if they didn't have a balance between big and small states, slavery could have easily been ended. So they had a compromise and created the upper house of the Senate that allowed for 2 representatives for each state to check the House and the president to check both, all independent of each other, and then the independent courts to check the other 2 branches, and the opposite was also true. This worked okay for much of the nation's history, but when the nation started the largest versus smallest state population, the ratio was 15-1. The Electoral College gave the states the combined number of senators and House members to get to vote for president, and while proportional voting would have been great, the Constitution gave the states the ability to elect as they pleased. So they jumped at winner-take-all, so that a large state, even though the president only won by 1 point, would have all those votes go toward the one who won that 1 point, which is why the Interstate Popular Vote Compact Agreement is trying to be pushed through, where when enough states sign it, the popular vote for the president nationwide will win, but if one party ended their winner-take-all in their states, and the other party didn't, that party that didn't would never have a chance at getting a president elected ever again. There's also the issue of the 3/5 compromise, where slaveholders essentially got to vote for all their slaves, but their votes were only worth 3/5 of a vote. This also helped ensure slavery couldn't be ended. After the Civil War and war profiteers bought their way into the Republican Party, it ceased to be a civil rights party and changed to a pro-business party, which made American politics literally the most openly corrupt system of government it has ever been, creating the Gilded Age. And when both sides stuffed ballots in the Hayes election and he lost both the popular vote and the Electoral College by 1 vote, Hayes, who was now pro-business, and unlike his predecessor Grant, who actually did give a crap about former slaves, Hayes cut a deal, pulling the army out of the South and letting him be president. In exchange, the South wouldn't go back to war, initiating the end of blacks in all forms of Southern government, including the Wilmington, North Carolina coup that possibly inspired Hitler. After that, black codes and then Jim Crow happened, and they reinstated the 3/5 compromise using the 13th Amendment clause that prisoners could still be used as slaves, so they made bogus laws that only affect black people so blacks could easily be sent to jail and put in pro-black code areas and used as slaves while boosting the population of that area and giving whites all those votes, and blacks now were counted as full people. So it was actually worse in some cases than the 3/5 compromise. Over time, corruption slowly waned, sort of, and changed, especially after the breaking of the party machine like Tammany Hall, and Teddy and Taft began putting restrictions on businesses for the first time, and of course, pro-business people hated it and claimed it was government overreaching because the default was to do nothing, completely ignoring that immortal corporations didn't exist and were regulated within an inch of their life for the first 100 years. Unions really started growing active and creating their own third parties, including an influential socialist and communist parties, and socialism was viewed as American as apple pie and just a natural step after Teddy Roosevelt's progressivism, who tried to push for universal healthcare. Of course, then Teddy got mad at Taft, started his own progressive party, split the vote, and the Democrats and Wilson won, killing any chances they had of that, and after enough non-intervention in the markets, the crash was so bad Southern and Northern Democrats, and many Northern Republicans, elected FDR, and he had lots of power, never before, which he used for 15 years. After the war and the Great Depression, the next generation was called the Silent Generation, who were so used to not questioning the government and following orders as their parents were a nation of former soldiers, they did little to act up. Because of this, during the 50s, the two parties were practically indistinguishable, literally split along the old Civil War lines. Republicans were conservative in the North and liberal in the South, and Dems were the opposite. And many Southern states were only one-party Democrat states because Lincoln was a Republican and they still really hated his guts. They worked across the aisle because they were literally on the same side, center authoritarian right. Then in the 70s, primaries opened up and self-selection happened, where more social liberals and progressives voted for the Democrats, and more conservative American libertarians, John Birchers and Klansmen, voted Republican. In fact, if a Republican tries to tell you that the Democrats were the party of slavery, let them know that once Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, the Dixiecrat Party was born, which splintered off of the Democrats in the South and ended up mostly joining up with the Republicans. If not for Nixon, it literally could have gone either way as to which party got the social liberals and which ones got the conservatives. That's how close and similar they were. It's why Obama in the first 2 years assumed wrongly that the GOP could work together with them like they had always had to find a compromise, but talk radio, Citizens United case, the Tea Party movement, and the fact that they now had self-selected so far apart from each other ideologically, the GOP just sat on their hands, and the default of the US government is inaction unless there are enough votes, and the GOP held the US government hostage for a decade. And of course, the party in power got all the blame for nothing getting done, while the party jamming things up all claimed they wanted limited government. So jamming things up was just fine for them, except the nation started fraying at the seams. Trump was more than willing to say literally anything to get elected, and since the more educated people had shifted parties over the past 20 years, he had to get the Republicans who couldn't see through his grift. Trump was just a Democrat back in the day because he thought abortion was okay. Otherwise, the GOP would have been just as much to his liking as things progressed. The GOP said rich people can get richer and more tax breaks, so he joined them and made a killing. This old way of thinking is why Joe Biden wistfully talks about the old days when Congress could work together to get stuff done, because they were essentially the same parties mixed and split between two parties. Also, back before Obama, there was something called pork barrel spending, which was money added to a bill for a particular representative district or a state that gave incentives to cross the aisle and do something for their state, even if they might be punished by their party, ensuring their re-election. During the 2008 campaign, McCain made a huge deal about pork barrel spending, and the House and Senate ended the practice as there was a popular demand against it. Without that, and with much of the GOP's money coming from big donors now, thanks to the Citizens United case overturning election finance law at the Supreme Court level, there was zero incentive to work with the Democrats. Because people focus on the candidates and not on the party like they do in the parliamentary system, when people say Obama and the liberals had 8 years and did nothing, what they actually had was power for 2 years with not enough senators to overcome a stupid, no-effort secret filibuster rule in the Senate that was created back when two parties were the same, and Reid could have ended it, but still had a nostalgia for the days when parties worked together because they were essentially the same party. This is why Pelosi had the votes lined up for single payer, and Obama was happy to sign it, but since they didn't kill that stupid rule, we ended up with a Heritage Foundation plan that was immediately demonized as socialism. Liberals literally had power for 2 years, and for the rest of Obama's term, we had inaction by the GOP. So thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm sure there was nothing controversial about this, and everyone will happily get along in the comments section, which you can do on the YouTube version of this video, or my Facebook page, After School Democracy. Link in the show notes. Just a reminder that I'm Anubis2814 on YouTube, and I have over 500 videos on different topics that I've made over the past 10 years. Please subscribe, and if your podcast site has the option, give me a like or review. If you think what I have to say informed you, consider supporting my Patreon. I'll be doing this podcast weekly and try to get it out on the same day, so I hope to see you here next week, ready to be filled with new ideas. Take care. This channel is helped tremendously by the generous supporters on Patreon. A big thank you to the wonderful Joe Taylor, Elias Garcia Guevara, and Ogrel for their support at the $10 a month Wapawet level. Please consider donating to my work if you can, and thank you all for listening.